Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG coming at you with another in-depth deck guide. This one for Naya Winota, the other pillar of the Pioneer format. The other deck along with Mono Green Devotion that seems to be dominating things of late and is probably considered one of the few Tier 1 decks. Outside of, you could argue, maybe Is It Phoenix and Blue-White Control at points. This is a aggressive combo deck that is pushed with a card Winota, Joiner of Forces, and combines it with some mediocre but serve purposes different creatures. It starts out with your Acceleration with Elvish Mystic and Llanowar Elves, along with Prosperous Innkeeper to give you early main acceleration to play your Winota or Joiner of Forces or Asika's Chariot on turn 3 ideally. You do have a series of turn 2 plays just in case your acceleration dies, such as Voice of Resurgence or Thalia, Guardian of Thraben as examples in this particular list. A bunch of new cards have been printed into the deck that's given it a little bit of an extra kick, and that being Brutal Cathar and Tolvar's Huntmaster. Cathar gives it a main deckable hate card that is a human that you can hit off of your Winota triggers. Fable of the Mirror Breaker allows you to put 2 bodies into play while also filtering through your deck to find your copies of Winota. Voice of Resurgence is especially important against in creature mirrors and control matchups. In creature mirrors, it is a 2 bodies. In control matchups, it punishes your opponent for playing during your turn. So if they're holding up removal for your Winota, or if they're trying to hold up a counterspell for your Chariot or your Winota, you can get tokens out of it, and then the tokens become almost as much of a problem to deal with as the Winota. Beyond that, the deck is playing the 3-color mana base, so it's a little bit tricky to get the right balance of pathways and dual lands. This particular version happened to run 1 layer of the Hydra, 1 mana Confluence, and 1 copy of basic Plains in the deck. Now, a lot of the decks that we'll be going through have eschewed the 1 copy of Plains, but this does make you a little bit more vulnerable to things like Field of Ruin and such if your opponent decides to go on a little bit of a land destruction plan, but oftentimes there's not a whole lot of time to do that, although people do play a little bit of land destruction because things like Nykthos are in the format as well. As far as the main hits off of this particular version, you go with Tolvar's Huntmaster, which most importantly is a human werewolf, and on the backside is a werewolf. So whenever it's during the day side, it counts as a human for a hit off of Winota, and then when it comes into play, it would come in as the night side, which will allow you to fight with other wolves, and then comes in with the additional bodies with the 2/2 wolves that come with a 6/6 body. Asika's Chariot is kind of important as kind of a grindy tool, as important for a plan B, as oftentimes Winota has become the keyed in thing as this is the most dangerous card in the deck. Oftentimes you'll have to use Asika's Chariot kind of as your backup bridge to get to your Tolvar's Huntmasters in the grindier matchups as your opponent brings in more removal, especially in the post-board games. Oftentimes there's a couple of flex spots in the deck. In this particular version, it's playing Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, and the Fable of the Mirror Breakers, which most versions are playing 3 to 4 copies of. Most versions do play the 8 mana Dorks as well as the 4 Prosperous Innkeepers. 4 Voice of Resurgence has also kind of become the norm. 1 of Lair of the Hydra seems to pop up in a lot of the lists, and 23 lands has generally been where most lists have landed. Personally, I might run 24, but I also like to hit my land drops and not get mana screwed. Beyond that, if you don't know what Winota does, basically for every non-human creature you have attacking, get a trigger, look at the top 6 cards of your library, you can put a human from your library into play. So as far as that goes, you have your Brutal Cathars, your Tolvar's, other copies of Winota, and then, out of the sideboard, a lot of decks run different ones, or in this particular version, you could also hit Thalia. So that's kind of what the main deck does. You're trying to set up an early Winota, get a bunch of triggers off of it and kind of overwhelm your opponent. In the post-board games, often things get grindier as people bring in efficient removal to deal with Winota, including cards we'll see in our own sideboard. But overall, game number 1 often comes down to goldfishing in this format, and very few decks can out goldfish a good Winota draw. Maybe Green Devotion and Lotus Field might be the only 2 decks that can actually out goldfish Winota, possibly some variants of Mono Red, although that deck has definitely fallen off since the loss of Luris. As far as your sideboard options, this version is a little bit different than some of the other ones we'll see. This is one of the ones that I played in one of the first videos on the channel since we've come back to doing Pioneer content, and that is copies of Domri Rade and Nissa Voice of Zendikar in your sideboard. This can be taken a lot of different forms that we'll see in a couple other lists. You can even have Xenagos the Reveler. There's a bunch of different card advantage things you can do for the grindier matchups like control decks, which tend to be the most difficult variants for Winota to face in the post-board games. Rending Volley seems to be the primary removal spell of choice in a lot of the post-board games because this hits two of the most important creatures for Winota. The first, of course, being Winota in the mirror matches. 1 mana being able to just hold up and kill your opponent's Winota before they can give them triggers off of it really sets them back in what they're doing. The other one is Thing in the Ice before it can flip and take over, both out of Is It Control and Is It Phoenix. Is It Control being a little bit of a tougher matchup as they tend to have a little bit more removal than Phoenix does, but both matchups can have their trickiness to what they're doing. Beyond that, you generally run some amount of spell hate, whether it be for Lotus Field or for the control decks, especially the Is It variety or against Is It Phoenix. You tend to run some number of, you can only play so many spells per turn, whether it be Arcana Maria, Deafening Silence. Some versions also run Eidolon of Rhetoric, as it's a little bit more difficult to kill with the 4 toughness, but doesn't have as much power and doesn't have the evasion of flying. And then the other card that's kind of a stalwart when you're playing against the more controlling decks, Elite Spellbinder, gives you another creature, another human that you can hit off of your Winota triggers, especially if you're boarding out your Brutal Cathars in the grindier matchups. And this gives you something that can hit and possibly throw your opponent's mana curve off, potentially setting their sweeper back 2 turns and allowing you to close out the game. As far as sideboarding, oftentimes you'll shave the Brutal Cathars as the first thing you'll shave, depending on the matchup. And then, depending on the matchup, you might shave, some number of your mana dorks. If some of your auxiliary threats aren't particularly good in the matchup, you might board those out as well. For instance, Thalia, you might board out against an all-creature-based deck, whereas Voice of Resurgence is generally going to stay in against maybe everything but Lotus Field, and would probably not be particularly good against Mono Green Devotion as well, so you might shave some copies there. But Brutal Cathar is usually the card you look to, especially against the grindier decks, to board out. Looking at some other slightly different variants of the deck, this particular version plays Ranger class in place of Thalia. Thalia obviously being a disruptive piece, Ranger class being a little bit better in the grindy games. Gives you the wolf body as it comes down, and if you're able to level it all the way up, level 2 makes each of your attackers a little bit more threatening. You can put the +1/+1 counter on one of them, and then if you can get to level 3, you can obviously play off the top of your deck and kind of overwhelm your opponent with card advantage. And you have enough other things in your deck that your opponent has to deal with that their marches and such might be overtaxed to be able to remove this from play. Another card you'll see popping up in these lists is Boseiju, as answers to things like Grafdigger's Cage and stuff, while also being a green land for your turn 1 mana dorks, which is important. Like I said, the mana base is very tricky to get because you do have 3 colors and you need to have green on turn 1 especially, so the mana base is definitely slanted towards green and red. White is probably the lightest color in the mana base. You probably tend to run 13 to 14 white sources, which is usually enough to hit Winota on turn 3 or turn 4, especially if you're counting Prosperous Innkeeper as a potential white source, although obviously that's a little bit risky, as it's more of a one-shot mana source. Beyond that, this version has the Thalias in the sideboard to pair with the Archons and the Deafening Silences. This version also happens to be running Skyclave Apparition, which is a decent card against a lot of the creature-based decks, as well as it's okay in some controlling matchups, understanding you're going to be giving your opponent a body back, but sometimes you just have to deal with particular cards out of theirs. And Elite Spellbinder, you'll see this in smaller numbers in this particular list over the other one, but once again, a card you bring in when you're bringing in Disruption. So this sideboard is a little bit different. You were playing copies of Selfless Spirit against Sweepers, which is an interesting addition compared to some of the other ones. Instead of trying to tax your opponent out, this one's trying to protect its creatures, a very important thing. And the other thing to mention is it does run Xenagos the Reveler as a additional threat. This is a Planeswalker that used to see a lot of play back in the day in Standard, and a little bit of play in the day in Modern. This is a card that comes down. It can add mana to your mana pool to be able to cast your higher end threats like your Hunt Masters and such, while also being able to pop out 2/2 hasty tokens threatening to overwhelm your opponent. And its exile and its ultimate is somewhat threatening, although generally you're going to be having this pump out tokens. As far as the list as well, it does run one copy of Kenrith, which some people still hold on to as one of your flex slots. Very powerful creature overall, but not the most powerful whenever your opponents are already targeting mono white or white creatures to kill. Kenrith does dodge things like Rending Volley, but does get hit by things by like Lightning Axe and such. So it is another threat you can play off of your Winota Joiner of Forces. This list goes for the 8-8-8 method across the board, and then tends to play 23 lands, and this is kind of their extra threat. This list is a little bit cleaner than some of the other ones as far as like what you're boarding in and boarding out, as you're oftentimes your 4-ofs are the stuff going out, whether it be Voice of Resurgence, Brutal Cathar, maybe shaving on some copies of the Fable of the Mirror Breaker, maybe shaving on your copy of Kenrith. Once again, up to you what you want to shave in and out, and depending on what you want to bring in. Like against Control, you could easily be bringing in all 9 of these cards, and it's a question of, well, do I have enough stuff to shave? Maybe you shave a Hunt Master, maybe you shave a Fable of the Mirror Breaker because it's legendary, maybe you shave a Mana Dork or 2. But then again, you have to watch as you bring in more expensive cards. How much of your Mana Dorks can you afford to shave? But then again, as you're playing against sweepers, you generally want to shone down on your Mana Dorks. And then one final list we'll take a look at. This version is playing another one that's also playing a Kenrith, so cards popping up a little bit, and then looking at the mana bases. This one's playing 2 mana confluences, no planes. This one's playing a planes. So a lot of it is, do you want to have basics for Field of Ruin in particular? And then Kenrith obviously popping up here again as a 5th big hit off of Winota Joiner of Forces. As far as the sideboard, this one also has a red cap melee in addition to Rending Volley. This one does 4 damage to any creature, but if it's non-red, you sack a land whenever it's dealt damage. And then, as another taxing effect, this particular version also plays Redain, which, gets a little bit awkward, in comparison to Spellbinders and such, as it's not a human, but it does have a lot of power in terms of being a 2/3 flyer. Also, if your opponent happens to be playing Snowlands for whatever reason, it's a bit of good hoser there. This one's version is playing Eidolon of Rhetoric, as I mentioned before, as another hate card you can run instead of Arcana Memoria. And then it's running the playset of Elite Spellbinders, and then 2 copies of Deathling Silence once again for the Izzet decks and for the Lotus Field decks, which you're mainly in a racing situation in the post-board games. As far as how the deck is positioned in the format, it's one of the few decks in the format that can consistently give mono green fits, which is one of its biggest selling points right now. There are ways to attack it. Mostly you want to attack it with an attrition-based game plan, whether it be a deck like Izzet Control or to a lesser extent as Izzet Phoenix, early burn spells plus Thing in the Ice, and then being able to board in things like Running Volley or Fry to kill Winota on the spot. Oftentimes you can kind of outgrind them and then just kill them with whatever arbitrary threat, whether it be a Nib Mizzet or a Thing in the Ice or an Arclight Phoenix, or just being hard blue-white control. Blue-white control matchup gets a little bit tricky as it becomes a game of kind of chip away, duck, goose, depending on if your opponent ever takes their shields down, if you can, maybe trick them into making them thinking your last card in hand's on a Winota. Maybe out of nowhere you can get like 2 Winota triggers out of, say they're tapped out for a Teferi, and all they have up is maybe 1 piece of interaction, and then you can double spell. Maybe play a creature that threatens to crew a chariot, and they counter that, and then you get to play your Winota and say, get to attack with like a Prosperous Innkeeper and a cat token, and then suddenly get 2 triggers and hit them with a Tolvalar, and all of a sudden the game's over. Those games become very particular or tricky, and then the other red decks can be a little bit tricky as well. Mono red can be a bit of a tricky matchup, especially if they can attack your early Mana Dorks. It's a very interesting back and forth, but pretty much any deck that is trying to interact with you can be tricky. That's why the Asika's Chariots and the Fable and the Mirror Breakers are so important, especially in game number 1. And then you're bringing in ways to disrupt and kind of have more knowledge of what your opponent's doing in the post-board games. So it gets to be an interesting back and forth, but once again, if you do want to beat the deck, you probably need to be on a control deck or like a Rakdos mid-range deck that just has a ton of interaction, a ton of ways to deal with creatures, and can close out the game in a fairly quick manner, as you don't really want to give Winota a ton of time to top deck out, especially if they're playing a little bit of a grindier version with, say, Ranger class and Chariots and any other grindy cards they might have, like some planeswalkers and such, you really don't want to give them a chance to get back in the game, as a top deck Winota with a couple of non-humans on the board can just be lights out. Another thing to consider is the werewolves are all non-human on their backside, which means whenever it's night during the game, they do also trigger Winota. So you can play a Brutal Cathar if it happens to flip over the next turn because your opponent doesn't play a spell. You play a Winota, all of a sudden you've taken care of one of their creatures while also getting a non-human for your Winota trigger. And then Tovolar, pumping out a bunch of tokens whenever it comes in, gives you even more tokens. So a lot of times with Winota, you have one big turn, or sometimes you have like a Winota get a couple triggers and then set up for the next turn for a big win. Now you can whiff. You do only run like 10 to 12 humans in the deck, so in some of those are Winota themselves, which that's up to you whether you want to have the Winota attacking or not, because Wandering Emperor is a thing in some matchups. So, depends on if you want to leave a creature back for blocking, but, most of the time you're going to choose whatever creature is best for the circumstance. Brutal Cathar if you need to remove a creature, Tovolar Huntmaster if you just want to put the most power on the board, Elite Spellbinder if you need to just check to see if your opponent has a sweeper for the following turn, maybe being able to throw them off curve and you're able to finish them off before they can cast a sweeper. A lot of different things to play with this deck, and it does require sequencing is the important thing. Knowing when to play your Winota, do you slam it immediately as soon as you can and do it for no value to play under a counter spell? Do you slam it, or do you wait a turn or two, get some more creatures on the board, and hope for a bigger setup turn? A lot of it depends on the nature of the game. If you're in a racing situation, generally you want to get it down quicker. If you're in a grindier situation, sometimes you want to be patient with it a little bit, try to bait out some removal, and get to the point where your opponent's exhausted their removal, and then you can slam a Winota and win from there. A lot of people starting to debate whether the card should be banned. This format is starting to get a little bit to the point where it was when people were calling for bannings when Inverter and such was a big thing. You have a bunch of linear decks going against each other, whether it be Lotus Field, whether it be Mono Green Devotion, whether it be Winota, and really the only interaction in the format are the blue-red base decks, such as is it Phoenix, is it Control, or Blue-White Control, although the Rakdos decks do bring some amount of interaction to the format. But overall, deck is very powerful, fairly straightforward to play. Sideboarding, generally you're going to be boarding out Brutal Cathars or Voices of Resurgence. You might shave on some of your mana dwarfs, you might shave on some of your top end if you don't think you're going to be able to get to them in certain games. But beyond that, deck's very powerful. It's one of the best decks in the format for a reason, and you should really at least have some idea of how to play against it if you're playing another deck in the format, or you might have to pick it up and try it a little bit to get an idea of how to play against it is always a good thing. Or if you like this kind of aggressive combo deck, you might also want to pick it up just to have a feel for what is arguably the best deck in the format. But I think that pretty much covers everything. We've covered up whatever its tough matchups, a little bit of sideboarding, different options with the thing. The development of the deck, it's changed a little bit over time. Primarily the Brutal Cathars and the Tovolar Huntmasters used to be Angrass Marauders, or Agent of Treachery used to be the top end. Marauders is a little bit more vulnerable to removal, whereas Agent of Treachery allows you to steal your opponent's biggest threat, but sometimes that isn't enough. And then, Fable the Mirror Breaker, Brutal Cathar kind of replaced the Legion War Bosses and Goblin Rabble Masters of the world. While those are very awesome threats and they do pump out a bunch of bodies, they are very linear only to the aggressive plan, whereas Cathar and Fable the Mirror Breaker can play a little bit of a grindier game depending on the thing. And finally, I forgot to mention, the Fable token, if you're pumping out copies of Tovolar's Huntmaster, or I guess you can't copy Chariot because Chariot is legendary, huh? But you can copy Tovolar's Huntmasters, you can copy the Brutal Cathars, you can copy a Voice of Resurgences, and then get dying triggers and get these enormous big elemental tokens. There's a lot of different things you can do with Fable the Mirror Breaker. Pretty much any mid-range deck in this format, or any deck that's playing right at this point, should be playing Fable the Mirror Breaker, even if I did kind of question it in the 4-color Planeswalker deck a while back. But, there's a lot of different angles of attack with this deck, and it's a lot of fun to play. So, if you like those kind of decks, you should really consider picking up and trying it. But anyways, this has been John for Pioneer Nexus MTG, giving you as quick a rundown as I could about all the key cards and sideboard options in the deck, as well as a little bit about sideboarding and how to play the deck.